Hello class. Today is Chapter 13, Classical Genres with Instrumental Music. The first genre we're going to talk about is the symphony. This has been slightly confusing for everybody most of the semester, but the symphony as a genre and the symphony orchestra are two different things. So the symphony as a genre is a multi-movement composition for orchestra lasting an average of about 25 minutes in the classical era. The origins are in the Sinfonia, which was a Baroque opera overture in 3 sections, fast, slow, fast. And we actually had one of Monteverdi's that followed that exact format that we listened to back in the Baroque unit. So these sections were expanded into movements by the time we get to the Baroque, beyond the Baroque era, and they are separate entities which together comprise the symphony. And by the mid-1700s, a 4th movement was added into the 3rd slot. So we, instead of fast, slow, fast, we have fast, slow, minuet, which is usually kind of an allegretto in between tempo, and then the fastest movement is the last. The symphony increased in popularity as public concerts became more common, and the terms symphony hall and symphony orchestra come from this genre term. Let's talk about the symphony orchestra a little bit, because the classical symphony orchestra begins to evolve more toward the modern orchestra of today. More wind instruments were added to increase the variety and color. The technical problems of being able to play in tune with everybody in the orchestra were gradually becoming fewer, because the inventions of the day were designed to help make the tuning of the instruments more universal, so they could play with strings and wind, say. Each section had a specific assignment in the classical era. The strings are very much still the core of the ensemble, and they present the bulk of the musical material. The woodwinds add richness and colorful counterpoint. The French horns sustain a sonorous background, and the trumpets and percussion provided brilliance and emphasis when needed. So here's a typical orchestra from the classical era, about 27 players total, and you can see a full complement of all strings, pairs of woodwinds, although not all of them were present at the same time often, brass instruments, and percussion sometimes. The symphony that you all have in Chapter 13 is quite a famous one, and you may have even heard this before. It's Mozart's Symphony No. 40 in G minor. He wrote it in 1788, just 3 years before he died. And the first movement is what we're going to hear, the Allegro, Molto Allegro. And once again, even though I go through and try to look for all these old references to get rid of, I didn't see it till just now. So this is in Mind Tap, and you'll see it when you are going through the chapter materials if you haven't already. The exposition shows a longish first melody, and you can see just by the pairs of eighths and then quarter kind of repeated pattern going on here between both parts of it that there's very much a repetitiveness to that rhythm. And in music history class, when I was a music student, we used to even sing words with this one, which were kind of silly. It's a bird, it's a plane, it's a Mozart, it was what we would sing. But I'm not going to sing that. I'm going to try to sing at least the entire melody for you, and pardon me if it's not fabulous. Da-da-dum, be-dee-dee-dee-dee-dum, ba-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da-dum, bum. And then the consequent part of it. da da dum be da dum ba da da dum ba da 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 dum dum. So that's the finished thought, the consequent part of the phrase, as opposed to the antecedent, which sort of sounds incomplete at the end of it. And in the development, Mozart takes little bits of the melody and starts to play with them and goes through a lot of key areas also in the process. But he even kind of flips it upside down in a way. So instead of da-da-dum, which is going a descending half step, he makes it go da-da-dum, although in a different key. But you can see how it's a mirror image sort of the actual line. In the recapitulation, the transition theme is extended and there's a brief coda. Your listening guide to this is very detailed and shows you the entire shape of the form in great detail. But remember, this is Sonata Allegro form, and I wanted you to see this with just a performing ensemble. So let's at least listen to part of this together. And I will say, kind of an odd conductor, but it's very high quality video, and it's done in a hall that would resemble where a public concert might have been performed back in Mozart's time. One of the odd things about the conductor is he doesn't use a conducting baton, and he seems to be using what us musicians call the downbeat and stir well technique of conveying meaning. But the orchestra is doing a great job of playing together, so I think he's doing a good job. I think he might be a bit of a tyrant to work for. There's a wood flute. It looks like a period instrument, the clarinet too. You ready for the repeat of the exposition? Interesting how he really doesn't convey the beat at all. He's really wanting them to listen to each other. It looks like most of the winds are playing, if not all of them, period instruments. One of the basses looks like a period instrument, and none of the string instruments. You can hear that little rhythmic figure. Da-da-da, da-da-da. Even in the accompanying line. Those are German bows. Bass players sometimes play with that type of bow instead of the French bow. Now listen to the development. The first theme modulates through several distant keys. The texture is going to change to polyphonic. It's going to be a small fugue developing right here. Imitative. In competition with each other. Now the first theme is going to kind of just be reduced to 3 little notes. Da da da. Now big sforzandi, loud attacks. Then we have what's called the retransition. You can hear that pedal point in the bassoons as the scales come down. And there we are, back home with the recapitulation in the original key. A little more polyphonic texture. Pause. Second theme in minor this time. It was in major the first time. And we're going to have a big crescendo. Closing material. Listen, it's going to be a rising chromatic scale. Here it comes. Very short coda ending. Three final chords and we're done. So that's the first movement of this symphony, and I thought you might enjoy seeing a performance of it. Next we have the string quartet. This is a genre of chamber music, and chamber music is exactly what it sounds like, music that can be played in a small space. This was created by Joseph Haydn, the string quartet, as a format. He figured out that 2 violins, a viola, and a cello together could make a surprisingly full sounding ensemble. And Goethe, the great German poet, compared it to a conversation among 4 intelligent people. I also want you to just take note that I talk about Mozart being from Austria and Haydn also. And Austria is a country today, but it really wasn't a country back then. It was all part of Prussia or I guess, what we call Germany now today. So if you might be a little bit confused in some of the biographical material where it's described sometimes in videos as them being German. So it's a case where the map has changed really since, well, a lot of times actually over the last few hundred years. So as the photo suggests here, each of the people playing the string quartets, including the nearsighted cellist, who I can totally relate to at this point. I've got to use my reading glasses to play. They all have their own music because they all have their own parts. And you will see there's a pattern here because the movements in a typical string quartet follow movements of a symphony: fast, slow, minuet, and fast. Usually it's a slightly smaller scope, so maybe not 25 minutes, maybe more like 15 to 20 minutes for the whole quartet. These can be performed by professionals and amateurs. I'm actually in a reading string quartet that just got together last weekend, and we read some Haydn quartets and also Beethoven. And in this day and age of so many choices with our entertainment, it seems rather quaint, but back then it was very typical for people to get together and play music together because that was another way that they could enjoy music, not being able to hear it in a recorded state and not being able to go to concerts constantly. And unless they were of royal origins, they would not have that opportunity anyway. So Haydn and Mozart actually played together in a string quartet for fun. And of course, Mozart was a little younger. But Haydn, his Opus 76, number 3, the Emperor Quartet, kind of chimed in with this quartet midway through his career. And, it was kind of later, actually, Opus 76. And this was 1797, and he really struck on quite the melody for this. It was an instant hit. Second movement, Poco, adagio, cantabile. So Poco meaning a little bit slow, and cantabile means singing in Italian. It's known as the Emperor because of its famous theme, which was dedicated to the emperor. And the melody was composed in response to military and political events and honored Emperor Franz II. The tune has served as national anthems for Austria and Germany both. It's used as a Protestant hymn in many Protestant hymnals, and the Emperor's Hymn was said to be Haydn's favorite composition by himself. This follows a theme and variations form, and I would be surprised if the majority of you had not heard this theme before, but you will have a chance to see if you know it in a moment. Each little bit of it repeats. And we're coming to the end of the theme. See the larger viola? The gentleman on the left is playing viola. Second violin now takes over the melody. First violin is doing a fancy part over the top, dancing around the melody. Lots of ornamentation. You could call this polyphonic texture because it's somewhat in competition. Counter melody. Even though there's two parts, it can still be polyphonic. So remember, texture is the relationship of the melody to all other lines. Next, the theme is going to move to the cello. This is much more of a homophonic texture. Still some little ornamentation in the first violin, but much more subdued. Notice how low their music stands are, so they're not a barrier to being able to visually communicate with each other. They're not looking at each other directly, but sometimes the violin is there looking up at the cello. No, don't stop. Now here's your chance to hear what a beautiful viola melody sounds like in this context. I don't know what happened to my internet, folks. Viola still has the melody. Everybody else is playing harmony. Still homophonic texture here. In the variation 4, we should hear more polyphonic texture again coming in. Still homophonic here. Everybody's kind of doing their own little riff. So a little bit of polyphonic texture coming in. Less chordal, more polyphonic in this section. Back to homophonic texture exclusively. Chords. And the nice resolution there. It's a beautiful melody. All right, time to go back to the PowerPoint. And next we have a genre that is mentioned in your textbook, the sonata. However, you have no listening guides for any sonatas. You don't have any listening assignments for sonata. but I think it's certainly worth mentioning because it's an important genre in the classical era. We might have talked about it a little bit in the Baroque context as well. This genre of chamber music is for solo piano or a solo instrument, any instrument in the orchestra, accompanied by the piano in that case. More sonatas were published in the 18th century than any other genre. And this was because many of them were written to be able to be played in the home. 3 movements, fast, slow, fast. They were performed by professionals and amateurs as well, and often used as teaching pieces for piano students. And even though this looks like a harpsichord here, I think it might be an early piano. I'm not completely sure. So let's hear what this sounds like. It also follows the same format as the symphony, the quartet. And here's a kind of a moderato or allegro movement. You can hear the piano accompaniment from the classical repertoire. Just a brief snippet of a Mozart sonata for violin and piano there. And if you'd like to look up more, there's lots and lots more to be found on the internet for sure. The concerto was a large-scale, multi-movement work for instrumental, soloist, and orchestra intended for public audience. Concerto is going to be at a level of difficulty that it would have to be a very accomplished amateur to pull this off with playing the solo parts. Virtuoso performers lured audiences to the concert hall, and the rise of the virtuoso, or virtuosa if it was a female, certainly was a phenomenon of the era. Concertos have the fast, slow, fast format of 3 movements with no minuet, and they did not expand to 4 movements, oddly enough, like the rest of the genres we've talked about today. Mozart composed 23 piano concertos alone, and he was considered the father of the modern piano concerto, and often he was the performer featured as a soloist. I just wanted to check this note here. The interesting thing about this little engraving here is that you can see that it's actually a woman being accompanied by the small orchestra playing a concerto, and this would have been a bit of an oddity during Mozart and Haydn's time to feature a woman. Not unheard of, but certainly rare. And he had to, certainly Mozart did teach a fair number of well-born young ladies and gentlemen, and so no doubt this was a performance set up for one of the more accomplished students that he had. So the Mozart Piano Concerto in A major, written in 1786, is a really beautiful example of this genre. And it's in chapter 13. You can find it. You can find a schematic drawing of it on page 189, and your listening guide, of course, is going to detail very much the special double exposition format of this sonata allegro form. And The piano and orchestra engage in a spirited give and take of the thematic material. This was written for his student Barbara Ployer. It could be that engraving was actually her. I was thinking it might be. But again, it follows a sonata allegro form, and it has a special thing called a double exposition, which became very common in the classical era. So the entire exposition is played by the orchestra. They play the entire thing, the first, the second, and the closing themes. Then the soloist comes in and they do the same thing with the orchestra accompanying them. So Mozart introduces a new lyrical melody in the strings when we expect the second exposition to end, when the soloist is playing. So I don't know if we will hear the entire thing, but I would like to at least play for you the double exposition of this piano concerto. It starts right out with the theme. It does not have a slow introduction. In A major. Then the woodwinds are going to take over the melody. Such a happy theme. Second theme, part A here. And then the woodwinds are going to play part A of the second theme. Doubling the strings. And here's part B of the second theme. This is the closing theme, part A. And part B of the closing theme. The piano's turn to be featured in this double exposition. Often the pianist has a lot of ornamentation around it, but you can hear the same melodies that were already introduced by the orchestra. This is a new theme. Mozart slips into the end of the second exposition. I was able to go a little bit into the development. And remember, Sonata Allegro form has exposition, development, and recapitulation. And you've seen the schematic for it. And I'm not going to expect you to be able to analyze it perfectly and figure out every single theme just by listening to it. But the listening guides are extremely helpful with determining form. And also, if you go to a concert, you can look at the program now and start to maybe look and figure out, the first movement of the symphony, I wonder if it's going to be in Sonata Allegro form, just like Ms. Austin said it might be. Or, oh, the third movement of a symphony, I wonder what that's going to be like. Is it going to be a minuet? Or if we get into maybe the Romantic era, Beethoven and others start to write scherzos, which are faster, but they're still in 3, like a minuet. So, we are almost done with this chapter's PowerPoint. And I did want to show you something interesting. Oh, of course, I forgot to put the link in. Cadenza is a showy passage just for the soloist. The rest of the orchestra actually will stop playing altogether, and then the soloist will begin playing material that is meant to sound kind of made up, like it's a riff, like it's an improvisation, although I think very few people actually make up their cadenzas on the spot nowadays because they're so technical. You can see the young lady playing cello on the left, how close her left hand is to the bottom of the fingerboard. It's a really high note on the cello, and it's usually the ideas are worked out even if the performer decides that they want to have a little fun with extra ornaments or something on the spot. They usually have in mind, I would say 95% of the cadenza worked out in advance. So we can see it's a showy passage for the soloist alone. It incorporates rapid runs, arpeggios, and snippets of previously heard themes into a fantasy-like improvisation. So I am just going to need to grab it'd be nice if I actually had this bookmarked, but I don't have enough bookmarks showing up. But let's see. This is not actually going to be a performance so much as a bit of a short video that describes how a composer, Jesse Montgomery, happens to come up with ideas for this young performer's concerto that she wants to have a new cadenza written for her. And incidentally, even though all of the composers almost that we have studied, except for very few, like Hildegard, happen to be male, because most of the composers in this era that were writing genres for orchestra were male. However, this is not to say that there were not female composers in the classical era. There were many, many female classical composers. And if you delve into classical music more, you might have a chance to actually attend concerts where you hear more concerts featuring women composers.
Well, we were on tour together for the Sphinx Virtuosi, and I had heard her piece called Strum, which was originally written for String Quartet, and I really enjoyed the piece. It has a lot of rhythmic variation and excitement. The harmonies are really advanced and avant-garde, but still very tangible. And the extended string techniques I thought were really interesting and exciting. And then after I heard Jesse's music, the idea just kind of popped into my head that she would be a great person to have write a cadenza for such a classical standard piece. That'd be really interesting and fun.
I noticed she has this sign for herself that says "suck less." Musicians are very critical of themselves.
So I then became very excited about it. Of course, I said yes. I really wanted her to kind of go crazy with it, but she really knocked it out of the park. I saw the score, and there's parts of Haydn and manipulations of the first theme and the second theme, and then little Jesse's signature, like right at the end, with a nice little cadence, and then little quotes from different things. I won't spoil it now.
So this is not the cadenza part of it.
Back to the score has really invigorated the material for me. I see it in not a totally new.
The only part that really is the actual cadenza was the very first part that we heard. But if you go to any concert that features a soloist, almost all of the concertos from the classical era and the Romantic era will have a part where the orchestra stops playing, except all you hear is the soloist playing, and that would be the cadenza portion. It's often performed at the end of the last movement, but sometimes there's also a cadenza in the first movement. So both of the Allegro movements usually feature a cadenza. So I hope you've enjoyed this chapter. It's not quite as long as some of them. And we only have one more chapter of PowerPoint before we are to week 15 and preparing for our finals. So our journey is nearly over, folks. I hope you have a great week.